Hello, my name is Alex Siles, and in today's episode we're going to be talking about the weapons that early medieval men were buried with. Welcome back. So in today's episode we're going to be talking about weapons that Anglo-Saxon men and other early medieval men were buried with. But if you like the sound of that, why don't you subscribe now, because I think you'll enjoy the content on this channel, and why not right away we'll jump straight into it. So weapons burial, specifically in the British Isles, happens generally from about the 5th to the 7th century AD, but there is some in the 8th century as well. Obviously some of that is to do paralleling with Scandinavian influence, but also it continues on within Anglo-Saxon England. So when you get these weapons burials, it's really interesting to see what different things are buried with the person, because you'd think that different weapons associate with different kinds of people, and there is a correlation actually. So the most common weapon that we find in burials are knives. Now the first thing to talk about is that knives are found with both men and women. They're a non-gendered item. In the early medieval period, and especially within the geographic area of England, both men and women are buried with knives, and they probably carried these throughout their lives, and they used them probably as a multi-tool. You'd have them for all sorts of different things, and they were very useful things to have. Also alongside this as well, infants are also buried with knives. And as you can see from this diagram here, the knives are placed all over the body. There's no sort of real correlation, except it's normally on the upper half of the body. The knives are laid down over the top of the burial. And so these knives are quite a common occurrence. The interesting thing about them though, is that as the age of the individual grows, they actually start getting larger. And with the oldest individuals, and also the individuals with the greatest stature, you start seeing them being replaced, especially in the 7th going into the 8th century, with seaxes, which is a sort of a long knife, very similar to a sort of a machete, but they're very specific, and they possibly give their name to the Saxons if you read some sources. But a seax is found in the oldest and largest burials. So the people with the largest physical stature, but also the greatest age, are also found with seaxes. So that's the kind of thing you find there with the knives. Following on from that, you get spears, which is this map right here. As you can guess, the spears are laid across, parallel to the body, and you can see the spearheads are on both sides of the head, both on the left and the right, though there are occasions where you can see them more towards the waist. That's probably where the spear has been ritually killed, so broken, and you do see this as well in the burials, that weapons are sometimes ritually killed so that they can be buried with the person who utilized them, or with the person as well. So you can see at the bottom, and that you also have spearheads at the feet. There is a tradition that has been associated with Frankish culture that the spear was buried with the spearhead at the feet rather than at the head, whereas what we generally consider as Anglo-Saxon culture, the spear is buried with the head up by the head of the individual. So you can see from that there is a lot of interesting correlation to where the spear is laid, and if there were multiple spears in the burial, they would also be laid around the body as well. Again, just like the knife, with age, the spearhead grows in size. So the older the individual, the larger the spearhead they're buried with. So infants, so young men are generally buried with quite a small one, which can be about an inch to an inch and a half long, and may also be sometimes interpreted as a toy or as a ritual weapon. And this is where I obviously find this quite emotionally, it draws on my heartstrings in a way, because it could be an unrealized dream for this child. You know, these guys, spears are a part of their life. They are an element where you'd have a spear for hunting and also for defense, and it's a symbol of a free man. You're not a slave, you can carry a weapon. And so most all Anglo-Saxon men who weren't slaves would probably have a spear in his house. So if you're burying, let's say, an 8-year-old right the way through to a 14-year-old, and you know, about 12 to 14 is when you become an adult. That's when you're a man. So before that, if you see these tiny little spearheads, it's kind of like you would have become a man. This is what you could have become. This is what our dream for you was, as you would be a free man. You'd have your own family, you'd have your own land, you'd have your own dreams, ambitions, hopes and joys. And so these tiny little spearheads that, you know, you could use, but aren't as necessarily practical as what you normally find as an actual spearhead, are almost like saying, well, we're not, you know, we're burying you with what could have been. And I think that's quite it's kind of beautiful, and it's also really interesting when you look at these burials, when you get a sense of that. But then also as you go older, so in people over the age of 40, the spearheads get larger and larger, probably as a status symbol. Again, saying, you know, this is a head of a family, possibly like a patriarchal figure, a head of, you know, of a dynasty possibly. And so we're giving him something that really shows off. It's a showy off weapon. And there is some suggestions from imagery of Woden and stuff like that, where he'd sit there with his spear beside his chair, and you can see it's quite a large spear, and there's possibly a correlation with that as well. It's more becoming like a sort of not a semi-divine figure, but it's more like a semi-mythological figure within your own household and the influence you'd have within your local community. Following after that, you would get your shield. So you can see right here, we've got shields. And so you would get a sort of a build-up of the different options that you would have burial. So you'd have knife burial, then spear and shield, spear, shield, sword, spear, shield, sword, seax. And that's kind of like, if you've got the full assemblage, it's the last one is the highest status. The people with spear, shield, sword, seax are the ones who are like really either very large in stature, physically big, as in like we would think them maybe possibly to be professional soldiers or fighters, or also very high status, so slightly older men, 40 plus, that sort of guys would have the full assemblage of weaponry. But when we've got these coming together, the shield obviously is the next item. And so you can see from this one right behind me here, the shield can be placed in a number of different areas within the burial, and it doesn't necessarily have a clear correlation with the rest of the burial. But you could imagine a shield could either be underneath or laid on top of the burial, and it is then a part of the assemblage of a fighter or of the Anglo-Saxon man during this period. Then the swords are really interesting, because as you can see from this one here, swords are either laying on the left-hand side, which is the most frequent, or sometimes across the body, and in some cases they're actually almost cuddled. So the sword is almost placed in here, and if you imagine my arm is like the sword, it would be cuddled into the body, and you can see it would be rested across the body, either diagonally or beside it. And so they're embracing the sword. This is quite an important part of their identity. It's quite an important weapon. It's a really quite a high status item to have a sword. And so these guys, when they have it, it's always close to the body generally. There are two instances where it's actually beside the body instead of on the body. And so that is sort of an outlier out there. So you can see that reflected with that tiny little blue dot. But majority of weapons burials, the sword will be with the hilt up here and then across the body, and it'll be cuddled in with the person with their arm across it. So again, there is almost like a curating of the burial, because obviously the person didn't die lying in the grave. Their relations, their family members, when they laid them in the ground, would place these items around them. So the spear would be placed down, the sword would be placed down, the shield would be placed down, and the sword is curated so that the person is holding it. It's a real important item. And actually, down in Kent, there's evidence in the 7th century of grave robbing, where people will actually break into the graves and take the swords out of the grave. Now, the interesting thing about this is it actually a rival family trying to basically dishonor your ancestor by removing their sword, or is it the families going back and taking the sword after the funeral? Because it's such a high status item, it has to be then returned back to the family, or maybe a couple of generations later, they go and fetch granddad's sword. It's another good question, and it's an interesting one, but it dies off around about 675 AD. So there's another really interesting one there. So with these different weapons, the weapons burials here, as you start going into the late 7th century, weapons burial really starts dying off. And it's really interesting to see this because there's a number of different factors. One possibility is that the kingdoms have become more powerful by the late 7th century. So you've seen Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex starting to form, really solidifying their power, also East Anglia as well. And so when they solidify their power, you don't need to sort of like necessarily bury these weapons into the grave and therefore, you know, make big statements about your family and who you are and that sort of stuff. Another possibility as well is that of Christianization. And obviously Christian belief is that, you know, you don't need to bury with items, because in the resurrection God will provide all of your needs. So that's when you start seeing unfurnished or burials without any items, and so the person is just simply buried in the ground in a white cloth or in a coffin, and then you get that sort of burial there. So it's really interesting, again, seeing these transformations in style of burial. But with the weapons, it's all to do with status of your family and also your age and your status within your family. So you can see a family who is able to do the full assemblage of spear, shield, sword, seax is really saying something to the people gathered around the grave. They're saying this person here was a warrior, this person here had status and influence within the area. Whereas someone maybe just burying with a spear or a knife, they're saying something else as well. So it's really interesting to see different cultural factors going on, and also different status factors, and also the sad parallel between someone who is quite elderly, and within the Anglo-Saxon world, I think most of you would think 50 years old today is a good sort of like middle age that we all would hope to achieve, and you know, most of us are expecting to live into our 80s if not 90s. Whereas you know, there's the tragedies as well of the 8, 9, 10-year-olds who are buried with small little spears because of possibly their family's dreams not being able to be realized with that child. So I really hope you've enjoyed today's video. I've been able to sort of tell you something about weapons burial in the early medieval period in the area of England, and that it really captivates your mind and your thoughts about how this world went. If you have enjoyed it, please do subscribe, share the video with your friends, and if you would like to support me further, I do have a Ko-fi account and also a Patreon account just down in the description, but there's no pressure whatsoever from me if you don't want to. In the meantime, have a lovely rest of your day, and I hope to see you in another video shortly.